vivid verses.
You've always been too sensitive about these things. My mother just wants what's best for us. And there it was. Not a slap, not a betrayal you could hold in your hands. Just that sentence, delivered with the particular confidence of someone who genuinely didn't understand what they'd just said. Let me back up a little. We'd been together long enough that I'd started making real decisions, not just about weekends, but about the kind of future that requires you to restructure your whole life around another person. 6 months before this, I'd turned down a contract opportunity that would have had me traveling for 3 months straight. Good money, interesting work. I passed on it because we were in the middle of something that felt like it mattered, and I didn't want to stress test it unnecessarily. That's the kind of thing I mean. The kind of sacrifice that never gets entered into any ledger because you make it quietly without announcement because that's what you do when you're all in. Her name was Camille. And here's the thing about Camille. She was sharp, warm even. In the early stretch, the relationship had a texture to it that felt real, felt mutual. But there had been signs, and I want to be honest about that because this isn't a story about being blindsided by a stranger. It's a story about small things I noticed and filed away and chose, each time, to interpret generously. The way certain arguments would end and then reopen 3 days later with new vocabulary, like the objection had been revised. The way she'd sometimes pause before responding to something I said, a beat too long, like she was consulting something internal. Twice I'd walked in the living room and she'd adjusted her phone quickly, not guiltily, just adjusted it. I noticed. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was the one with the pattern recognition problem. The moment I first felt something was wrong, really felt it, was about 4 months in. We'd had a disagreement, minor, the kind that's really about two people figuring out how they handle friction. And the next morning she came back to it with a 4-point rebuttal that was structured like she practiced it. I remember thinking, I remember choosing to think, she's just thorough. She processes overnight. Some people are like that. I chose wrong. The night of the opening quote, we've been talking about her mother's habit of calling 3 and 4 times a week. I gently, and I mean gently, I wasn't looking for a fight, mentioned that it sometimes felt like her mother had a vote in our relationship. That was my phrasing. A vote. I wasn't accusing anyone of anything. I was opening a door. Camille looked at me with this expression I can only describe as patient disappointment. You've always been too sensitive about these things. My mother just wants what's best for us. I didn't say anything immediately. Always. She said always. That's not a response to tonight. That's a pre-written answer. I sat with it. Poured myself a glass of water I didn't need. Set it down. Came back to the table. And I looked at her for a long moment. And I said, okay. Just that. Just okay. And I let the conversation move on to something else because the investigation had already begun and investigations don't benefit from tipping your hand. She went to bed thinking we'd resolved something. We hadn't resolved anything. Here's where I started doing the math. The thing about being a careful person is that you keep records without meaning to. Not documents, just memory. Sequence. The order of things. And when you start laying the sequence out flat, sometimes the shape of it is unmistakable. Start from the beginning. Don't skip anything. Find the load-bearing moments. First item. The contract I turned down 6 months prior. Roughly $40,000 in consulting fees over a 3-month engagement. I passed because Camille had told me, not asked, told, that she thought the timing was bad for us. At the time, I'd internalized that as us making a decision together. Looking back, I now wondered whose analysis I'd actually heard. Second item, the apartment. I'd been the one to find it, negotiate the lease, front the deposit when her portion was delayed. She'd paid me back 2 months later, which I'd been fine with. I'd spent 30-plus hours over 3 weeks coordinating contractors for the renovation work she wanted done on the second bedroom. Not one of those hours had ever been acknowledged as a contribution. When her mother visited for a weekend and noted the work, Camille had said, "I made sure it was done right." I had been in the room. I had said nothing. Third item, Thanksgiving, 8 months ago. Her family. I had organized the entire dinner. The cooking, the shopping, $400 out of pocket because the we'll split it later never materialized. Her mother had sat at the table I'd set and eaten the food I'd cooked and asked Camille, in front of me, whether I was financially stable. Camille had laughed it off. I had smiled. I had filed it. Fourth item, the argument about her friend Rochelle, the one that started in March and then somehow reignited in April with language I didn't recognize from our original conversation. I'd said one thing in March. When it came back in April, it had been reframed, sharpened, and redirected in a way that felt forensic. Someone had worked on it. At the time, I couldn't name who. Now I could. The vocabulary changes between rounds. The argument gets refined. She's bringing it back edited. Fifth item, my salary. I had told Camille what I made. Of course I had. We were talking about a shared future, and I had told her in confidence. Not because I was embarrassed, but because it's private information that belongs in a relationship, not a family briefing. 3 weeks later, her mother had made a comment at dinner. Nothing direct, just a reference to people in your bracket during a conversation about something unrelated. Pointed enough to land. Camille hadn't flinched, which meant she hadn't been surprised. Sixth item, and this one landed the hardest. 8 weeks ago, I told Camille about my father, about the 2 years we didn't speak, the nature of what had broken between us, and the version of myself I'd had to rebuild after. I told her late at night, the kind of conversation you only have when you feel genuinely safe with someone. She had held my hand. It had felt like intimacy. I now had to consider that I had been speaking to a relay station. She looked me in the eye while I told her the most private thing I have. And then she called her mother. By the time I'd reached the end of this reconstruction, sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning with a legal pad I never wrote anything on, the picture was complete. This wasn't bad days. This wasn't immaturity or thoughtlessness. This was a structural arrangement in which every decision, every argument, every vulnerability I'd shared had been uploaded and processed by a committee of 2, and the output of that committee had been routed back to me as though it were just Camille thinking for herself. I wasn't in a relationship. I was in a managed channel. The decision formed quietly, the way real decisions do. Not with heat, not with fury. Just a door closing. No announcements. No explanations before they're earned. Find the edges first. The operation ran over about 11 days. First move, I stopped sharing. Not dramatically, not with a visible wall going up, just quietly, completely. If Camille asked how a work situation was going, I'd give her the broad outline and nothing more. If she asked how I was feeling about something, I gave her the true surface and kept the depth. I didn't make it cold. I made it careful. The difference is visible if you know what you're looking for. And yeah, I know how that sounds, strategic. But you have to understand, I wasn't doing this to punish anyone. I was running a diagnostic. I needed to know how fast certain information traveled. I told Camille, casually, over a Tuesday dinner, that I was thinking about buying a car. Not just any car. I gave her a specific detail. Told her I was looking at a used Land Cruiser, that I'd found one a few hours away that was priced well, and I was going to drive out that weekend to look at it. I had no intention of buying any car. By Thursday, her mother called, and within the first 4 minutes of small talk, because her mother did do small talk before the real agenda, she said, "Camille mentioned you're thinking about a significant purchase. You know how those older vehicles can be money pits." There it is. I said, "Oh, I appreciate the thought." Nothing more. The mother continued talking. I let her. I thanked her for the concern and said I'd keep it in mind. I hung up and sat for a moment in the stillness of what had just been confirmed. 48 hours. The latency is 48 hours. Second move, the question. I came to Camille 2 days after the phone call. Not with accusation, not with anger, just a question delivered like I was asking about the weather. I said, "When you talk to your mom during the week, what does that usually look like?" She smiled, looked up from her phone. "Just catching up. You know how she is." "Sure," I said. "Does she ask about us? Or is it more her stuff?" A pause. The kind where something is being selected rather than recalled. "A little of both, I guess." She said, "Guess." She knows exactly. And when there's something going on between us, I said, "Still easy, still conversational. Does that come up?" She set her phone down. The shift was subtle, not defensive, not yet, just recalibrating. I talked to my mom about my life. "You're part of my life." "Of course," I said. "I'm just wondering how specific those conversations get." She told me I was being paranoid. That was the word she used. Paranoid. She said paranoid. Her mother would have suggested that word. I said, "Okay." And I left the room. Third move. I stopped attending the weekly Sunday calls. Camille did these long calls with her mother every Sunday, always in the bedroom, always with the door closed, usually around 90 minutes. I had never objected before. Now, for 2 consecutive Sundays, I made myself scarce. I left the apartment, came back when they would have been winding down, said nothing about it when I returned. The third Sunday, Camille mentioned, almost offhandedly, that her mother had asked why I never seemed to be around anymore. She's noticed the absence of raw material. I said, "I'm around plenty. I just figured those were your calls." "They are." She just liked when you'd say hi. She liked the access. "I'll keep that in mind," I said. Fourth move, and this one required patience. I let one legitimate argument happen naturally, and I watched how it moved. We disagreed about something real, plans with her friends that conflicted with something I'd already committed to. A genuine point of tension. I stated my position once, clearly, without escalation. She pushed back. I said, "I hear you." She pushed back again. I said, "I heard you the first time." And I left it there. 47 hours later, she came back to it, and the reframe was precise. New vocabulary, a specific angle I hadn't introduced, a particular phrase, "You prioritize your obligations over our relationship," that had a professional quality to it, like something sourced. That phrase didn't come from her. That's coaching language. I looked at her steadily. I said, "Where'd that come from?" She blinked. "What do you mean?" "That framing. Did you come up with it? Or did someone suggest it?" "I talked to my mom, okay? I'm allowed to talk to my mom." There it is. Confirmed without asking. I said, "I know you are." And then I said, with zero performance in my voice, just clarity, clean and cool, "I'm in a relationship with you. When that's true for you too, let me know." She stared at me. I walked to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and made tea. Fifth move, I stopped correcting the record in small moments. When her mother's framing came back to me through Camille, because I could identify it now, the specific vocabulary, the particular angles, I would just say, and let it sit. I didn't argue. I didn't provide counter-evidence. I let the operating manual become visible by not disrupting its machinery. Sixth move, I had a conversation with my closest friend, not about the details, just about the shape of things. I needed one external person to have rough knowledge of the timeline, not to recruit them, just a record. Seventh move, I began quietly documenting, not surveilling, documenting. I kept a note on my phone with dates and quotes. When certain phrases appeared, I logged them. When information I'd shared privately appeared in conversations it had no business being in, I logged it. Within 2 weeks, the pattern was so consistent you could set a clock to it. This is no longer theory. This is a calendar. Eighth move, the one that closed Act 3, I did the thing that cost me something real. I told Camille, plainly and without cruelty, that I needed us to agree to a boundary. Conversations with her mother about our relationship, our conflicts, my finances, things I shared with her in private, needed to stop. She didn't yell. She went very still. You're asking me to limit my relationship with my mother. No, I said. I'm asking you to keep our relationship between us. That's the same thing. It isn't, I said. But I've said it once, so I won't say it again. And there it was. The line. Drawn calmly, in broad daylight, without drama. She knew what it meant. I knew what it meant. Whether she was willing to honor it, that was what the next chapter was about. The tribunal assembled faster than I expected. Honestly, faster than I would have. It started with her friend Nadia. Called me on a Wednesday morning, which for context, meant Camille had been on the phone the night before. Nadia was warm, well-meaning, and working entirely from secondhand narrative. I'll let her finish. She has Camille's version, edited and processed. Let her run. Nadia said that she understood I had some concerns about communication in the relationship, but that Camille's mother was just a very involved parent, and that this was just how their family operated, and she hoped I wasn't going to make Camille choose. I said, Nadia, did Camille tell you what I said when I left the conversation? Pause. She said you just shut down. She said I shut down. She didn't tell her what I actually said. I said, I'm in a relationship with you. When that's true for you too, let me know. Silence. I didn't shut down. I made one statement and I walked away. Did she mention that part? She didn't. Okay, I said. I appreciate you calling. And I ended it there. No elaboration. No editorial. And then, I kid you not, the next one called 20 minutes later. Her colleague James, a guy I'd met maybe 4 times, who had apparently been briefed extensively on what a problem I was being. James came at it from a different angle. Practical. Didn't I understand that close families communicated differently? Wasn't I maybe projecting some personal stuff here? I'll let him finish. He's using my biography against me. The father story. She told her mother. Her mother told James. There are multiple transfers in that chain. The father story. I sat with that for a moment before responding. James, I said, did she tell you what specifically I asked her to stop sharing with her mother? He hesitated. She said you wanted her to cut her mom off. Did she tell you about the conversation where she told her mother information I'd shared with her in private? Personal history, not relationship stuff. And her mother used it in a phone call to me within the same week. Long pause. I wasn't aware of that. Now you are, I said. Thanks for calling. Gone. I set my phone down and stared at the ceiling for a moment. She gave them the story about my father. She handed them my ammunition. That was the one that cost me something emotionally. Not the anger. I didn't let anger in. But the cost of seeing clearly is that you see everything, including that. Contact 3. Her cousin Bria, who called that same evening and who I actually liked. Bria was sharp, and I had a lot of respect for her, which made it matter more that she'd been handed a partial account. I let her finish. She said, look, I'm not taking sides. I just think her mom means well, and sometimes you have to take the relationship for what it is. She's trying to normalize the structure. She may not even know what the structure is. I said, Bria, did Camille tell you what started this? Specifically what I found out and when? Pause. Differently textured than the others. More thoughtful. She said you accused her of gossiping with her mother. I didn't accuse her of gossiping. I asked her to stop sharing my private history and our private conflicts with someone outside the relationship. Did she tell you what information her mother had already passed back to me? No. Did she mention the car? The what? I told her. Briefly. Just the facts. No editorializing. Bria was quiet for longer this time. She said finally. And the weight of that HM was different from anything the others had offered. That's different. I said, I appreciate you. And I'll let it end there. Contact 4. A mutual friend named Terrence, who I think was genuinely trying to broker peace and who had no idea that wasn't what was needed here. Terrence's pitch was reconciliation flavored. Couldn't we all just talk it through? Maybe the three of us, maybe include the mother on a call to clear the air? He wants to seat the committee at the negotiating table. No, I said. Terrence, did Camille tell you what I said about wanting to work this out between the two of us? She said that you kind of shut her out. Did she tell you the specific thing I said when we last spoke? He paused. She said something about a relationship. I said, I'm in a relationship with you. When that's true for you too, let me know. Did she tell you that part? Not in those words. Okay, I said. I hear that you want to help. I genuinely appreciate it. But this one has to work itself out directly. Contact 5. Her mother's friend, a woman named Gloria, who I'd met twice and who had absolutely no business being in this conversation, which told you exactly where the chain of communication had gone. Gloria called, identified herself, and launched into a 3-minute speech about how devoted a mother Camille's mom was, how she'd seen her support Camille through everything, and how it was very difficult to watch someone who loved her daughter be treated as though she were the problem. I let her finish. She's been talking to the mother directly. This is the mother's last relay before she comes herself. Gloria, I said, thank you for caring about their family. Did the mother tell you what specifically I asked for? She said you wanted Camille to stop talking to her. Did she tell you why? Silence. I asked Camille to stop sharing private information I'd given her in confidence, including things about my own history with people outside our relationship. That's all I asked. Did she mention that part? Silence. I thought not, I said. Thank you for calling, Gloria. Done. And this is the part I want you to really sit with, Bria called back. Not the cousin performing loyalty to his side. Bria calling back on her own 2 days after our first conversation because she'd done something I hadn't asked her to do. She'd looked into it. She'd talked to Camille directly, asked different questions, and what Camille had said, when pressed, had confirmed enough of the shape of things that Bria had called me back not to negotiate, but to say, I owe you an apology. I didn't have the full picture. Don't show what that costs. Just register it. I said, you called me when you thought I was wrong. I respect that. Thank you for calling me when you thought otherwise. She said, she's been doing this for a long time, hasn't she? I said, yeah. And that was all we needed. The same day, Camille called, not to talk exactly, but because she could sense the architecture shifting, and she was afraid, and afraid people don't always know what they're trying to accomplish when they pick up the phone. She said, I know what you're doing. What am I doing? You're turning people against me. She still doesn't understand that I haven't said anything bad about her. Not once. I said, I haven't said anything bad about you. To anyone. I ask one question. I'll let people draw their own conclusions. That I asked something. You can believe that if you want, I said. I've said my piece to you once. I won't say it again. She was angrier than I'd ever heard her. And that anger was, I think, the sound of a version of reality she'd constructed beginning to come apart at the load-bearing joints. I stayed quiet. I stayed steady. And I waited. I didn't have to wait long. Her mother showed up on a Saturday morning. I hadn't been told she was coming, which told me something about the current state of the relationship's internal communication. She was standing at the door with the posture of someone who had rehearsed this. Her name was Carolyn. I opened the door and did not step aside. I think it's time we talked, she said. She said I should clarify the guest list. Camille's inside, I said. This is between you and me, or it's not happening. She came in. I gestured to the kitchen table. Small, practical, nowhere to perform. She sat across from me. Camille hovered near the hallway, and I said, gently, give us a minute. She hesitated, then retreated. Carolyn opened with love. She always opened with love. I'd noticed that. The word was structural for her, deployed early to occupy the high ground before anything else could. She said she loved her daughter. She said she only wanted what was best for her. She said she'd supported Camille through things I could only imagine, and that she wasn't going to apologize for being a present mother. I let her finish. She's done 3 things: established motive, claimed history, and preemptively refused to apologize. That's a full defense in 30 seconds. She's practiced this. Carolyn, I said, did Camille tell you what I asked for? She said you wanted her to stop talking to me. Did she tell you what specifically I asked her to stop sharing? A brief recalibration. She said you felt your private conversations were being discussed. Not felt, I said. I confirmed it. I gave Camille specific information, verifiable, specific information, and within 48 hours, it came back to me through you. I've documented that. I can show you the dates. She shifted. She didn't know about the documentation. My daughter has every right to confide in her mother. She does, I said. Completely. She could tell you anything about her own life. What she cannot do, what I asked her to stop doing, is relay private things I told her in confidence. That's a different thing. You're asking her to choose. That's the frame she's been working from. Let me dismantle it once. I'm asking to be in a relationship with Camille, I said. Not a relationship with a structure that includes you as a standing member. Every argument we've had has come back revised with your fingerprints on it. Every vulnerability I shared with her reached you within days. I know that because you've used that information in conversations with me. She went still. The dinner conversation about financial brackets. You remember that. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. She remembered. My father, I said. I told Camille something personal about my father. In private. And it found its way to other people through a chain that started with you. I would never. I'm not asking you to confirm it, I said quietly. I know what happened. I'm telling you what I know. The room was very quiet. You're a good mother, I said, and I meant it. I want to be clear. I meant it without irony. You have clearly been there for Camille in ways that matter. That's not in question. What is in question is whether Camille gets to be an adult partner in a relationship without every decision, every conflict, every private thing I share being routed through you for processing. Carolyn's jaw tightened. She needs guidance. She needs a partner, I said. And I cannot be that in the arrangement that currently exists. Then Camille appeared in the doorway. I don't know how long she'd been standing there. I looked at her, and I said it simply, cleanly, with no cruelty and no performance. Just the same thing I'd said before, now at full weight. I'm in a relationship with you. When that's true for you too, let me know. Then I looked at Carolyn. I think you should go. Carolyn stood. She looked at her daughter. She said, you don't have to put up with this. I said nothing. Camille looked at her mother, then at me, then at the floor. I walked to the door and opened it. Carolyn left, and I looked at Camille and said quietly, I think we're done here. She called 3 days later. Not to argue. That phase was over. To talk. And the conversation that followed was different in texture than anything we'd had in months, maybe ever. She wasn't working from a script. She told me her mother was no longer going to be briefed on our conflicts. She told me she'd talked to Carolyn directly and told her that the weekly debrief calls were changing in structure. She would talk to her mother, of course she would, but the relationship needed to be a closed system going forward. Carolyn had pushed back. Camille had held. That was the first concrete change. And I heard it. Second, she looked back at the finances, the deposit I'd floated, the Thanksgiving dinner I'd funded, and she wrote me a check. Not for everything, and I hadn't asked for anything, but she had done the math herself and arrived at a number and produced a check. That mattered in a way that had nothing to do with money. Third, she told me that she'd removed her mother from a group chat that had included Camille's friends and, apparently, periodic updates about her life. I hadn't known the group chat existed. I noted that privately and said nothing. Fourth, she'd returned a key. Her mother had a key to our apartment. Had for some time, a fact I'd known and had been vaguely uncomfortable with and had chosen not to address. Camille told me she'd asked for it back, and that the key was in an envelope on the counter if I wanted to see it. I didn't need to see it, but I noted what it had cost her to give it back. Fifth, she told me she'd spoken to Bria and to Nadia and had corrected the record. She'd told them, in her own words, that she'd been handling things in a way that wasn't fair to me. She didn't perform this as a grand gesture. She told me the way you tell someone something that hurt to say, straightforwardly. I sat with all of it. She said, I know this happened fast. I said, the speed isn't the question. Then what is? Whether the structure is actually different or just rearranged. Whether it's real, I said. She looked at me steadily. It's real. A silence. Not an uncomfortable one. Then she said, I hear you. When that's true for you too, let me know. I looked at her for a long moment. She'd taken the line back, used it on me, turned it into an offering instead of a door closing. That's not something you coach someone to do. That comes from actually sitting with something long enough to understand its weight. I didn't smile exactly, but something released. We're still finding our footing. I'm not going to wrap this in a bow that isn't there yet. But the thing that existed before, the committee, the relay structure, the version of intimacy that came through a third party, that's gone. I can tell because the arguments are messier now. Less refined. When she pushes back, the vocabulary is hers. When she's uncertain, she's actually uncertain. It's harder in some ways. It's also real. Look, here's what I actually think about all of it, having come out the other side. A relationship isn't a franchise where someone else holds the intellectual property. You can love your family and still understand that what happens between two people belongs to those two people. The moment you start outsourcing your interior life to a third party, handing them the arguments, the vulnerabilities, the private history, you're not protecting the relationship. You're dismantling it. I wasn't too sensitive about these things. I was precise about them. And the difference between those two things is everything. The version of Camille I'd been navigating wasn't built by malice. It was built by habit. But once you see the architecture, you can't unsee it. And you can either ask for something different or you can go. I asked once. Then I let the structure speak for itself. Then I drew the line. And when she finally had to stand alone in the room and decide what she wanted, without coaching, without the relay, without revision, she chose the relationship. That's the part I'm holding on to.
Thanks for listening.